The Cold War was a period of political tension and military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from the end of World War I until the early 1990s. It was a global conflict that shaped the course of world history and had a profound impact on the lives of millions of people around the world. In this video, we will explore the Cold War from a global perspective, examining its causes, key events, and lasting legacy. Footage of the Berlin Wall being built. The Cold War began in the aftermath of World War I and II, as the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two superpowers. The Soviet Union was a communist state, while the United States was a capitalist democracy. These two ideologies were fundamentally opposed, and tensions between the two nations quickly escalated. Footage of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War was characterized by a series of proxy wars, espionage, and propaganda campaigns. The most famous of these was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was sparked by the Soviet Union's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. Footage of the Vietnam War. The Cold War also saw the United States become embroiled in a number of conflicts around the world, including the Vietnam War. The war was fought between communist forces in North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States. The conflict lasted for over a decade and resulted in the deaths of millions of people. Footage of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was also involved in a number of conflicts during the Cold War, including the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet Union's decision to invade Afghanistan was met with international condemnation, and the conflict lasted for nearly a decade. Footage of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Cold War came to an end in the late 1980s and early 1990s as the Soviet Union began to collapse. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in world history. The Cold War was the result of a complex set of factors, including ideological differences, geopolitical tensions, and the legacy of World War I and II. Footage of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. One of the key causes of the Cold War was the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was a capitalist democracy, while the Soviet Union was a communist state. These two ideologies were fundamentally opposed, and each side saw the other as a threat to its way of life. Footage of the Yalta Conference. Geopolitical tensions also played a role in the onset of the Cold War. At the end of World War I and II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two superpowers. The two nations had different visions for the post-war world, and tensions between them quickly escalated. Footage of the Soviet Union's annexation of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union's annexation of Eastern Europe after World War I and II was another key factor in the onset of the Cold War. The United States saw this as a threat to its own security and began to take steps to contain Soviet expansion. Footage of the Korean War. The legacy of World War I and II also played a role in the onset of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies during the war, but tensions between the two nations began to rise in the aftermath of the war. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War. Footage of the arms race. The arms race was another key factor in the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, and each side saw the other as a threat to its own security. This led to a dangerous escalation of tensions, as each side sought to outdo the other in terms of military might. The Cold War was characterized by a series of key events that shaped the course of world history. In this segment, we will explore some of the most significant events of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most significant events of the Cold War. In 1962, the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. The United States responded with the naval blockade of Cuba, and the two nations came dangerously close to nuclear war. The Vietnam War was another key event of the Cold War. The war was fought between communist forces in North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States. The conflict lasted for over a decade and resulted in the deaths of millions of people. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was another significant event of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's decision to invade Afghanistan was met with international condemnation, and the conflict lasted for nearly a decade. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in world history. The wall had been a symbol of the division between East and West, and its fall signaled the reunification of Germany and the end of the Soviet Union's dominance in Eastern Europe. Footage of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was the final event of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had been the world's other superpower, and its collapse marked the end of the bipolar world order that had characterized the Cold War. The Cold War had a profound impact on the world, shaping the course of history and influencing the lives of millions of people. In this segment, we will explore the global impact of the Cold War. The Cold War had a significant impact on the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was fought between communist forces in North Korea and the government of South Korea, which was supported by the United States. The war resulted in the division of Korea into two separate nations, with the North becoming a communist state and the South becoming a capitalist democracy. The Vietnam War was another conflict that had a significant impact on the world. The war was fought between communist forces in North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States. The conflict resulted in the deaths of millions of people and had a lasting impact on the political and social landscape of Vietnam. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union had a significant impact on the world. The development of nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war created a climate of fear and uncertainty that lasted for decades. The collapse of the Soviet Union had a profound impact on the world. The end of the Cold War marked the beginning of a new era in world history, with the United States emerging as the world's sole superpower. Footage of the reunification of Germany. The reunification of Germany was another significant impact of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 signaled the end of the division between East and West Germany, and the reunification of the two nations had a profound impact on the political and social landscape of Europe. The Cold War may have ended in the early 1990s, but its legacy continues to shape the world today. In this segment, we will explore the lasting impact of the Cold War. Footage of the spread of democracy. One of the legacies of the Cold War was the spread of democracy around the world. The United States and its allies promoted democracy as an alternative to communism, and many nations around the world adopted democratic systems of government in the wake of the Cold War. Footage of the rise of China. The end of the Cold War also marked the beginning of a new era of global competition, with China emerging as a major economic and political power. China's rise has been shaped by the legacy of the Cold War, as the nation seeks to assert its influence in the world stage. Footage of the ongoing threat of nuclear war. The threat of nuclear war remains a legacy of the Cold War. Despite efforts to reduce nuclear arsenals around the world, the possibility of a nuclear conflict continues to loom large, and the legacy of the Cold War serves as a reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons. Footage of the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. The legacy of the Cold War can also be seen in the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. Many of these conflicts have their roots in the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union sought to exert their influence in the region. Footage of the ongoing tensions between the United States and Russia. Finally, the legacy of the Cold War can be seen in the ongoing tensions between the United States and Russia. Despite the end of the Cold War, the two nations continue to view each other with suspicion, and the legacy of the Cold War continues to shape their relationship.